Hello and welcome to The Reading Room in conversation with Mark Tedeschi, a man of many talents and accomplishments, a senior Crown prosecutor and barrister, a photographer, and relevant to today's discussion, the author of the true crime novel, Eugenia. Mark, thank you for joining us today. How are you?
Oh, good, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be joining you.
Well, we're certainly happy you're here with us. Also joining us today, we have Carol and Tracy from The Reading Room. They're two of our members on the site, and we'll be hearing from those guys shortly. Eugenia is a remarkable story, even more notable because every word of it is steeped in fact. We've all heard the phrase that truth is stranger than fiction, and never has that been more evident than Mark's recount of this incredible story from Australia's past. Eugenia Falleni was born a woman who lived 22 years as a man. Brutally raped by the captain of the ship on which she worked, undetected as a male, Eugenia was dumped in Sydney, pregnant and without anyone to lean on, and gave birth to a daughter, Josephine, who she left in the care of another woman to take up life as Harry Crawford. And Mark, correct me if I get anything wrong, please. I'm going off memory here and a few notes. Eugenia married twice and managed to conceal her bodily gender until Annie Burkett, his first wife, was informed of Harry's gender by a neighbour and subsequently disappeared after a picnic with Harry near the Lane Cove River. His second marriage was to Elizabeth King Allison, who remained Harry's wife until his arrest for Annie's murder in 1920. And what followed was one of the most extraordinary criminal trials in legal history. Mark, I suppose my first question to you would be, how did you discover Eugenia's story, and how do you think it is that we hadn't heard her story prior to the publication of this novel?
Look, in its day in 1920, the whole of Australia was riveted by the trial of Eugenia Falleni. There wouldn't have been a single person in Australia, in New Zealand, maybe even in Italy, because it was broadcast over there, who didn't know her story and the fact that she'd lived for 22 years as a man and had married twice. But over the years, the story had largely been forgotten. In 2005, I first came across the story when I was doing some research for a speech that I gave for the 175th anniversary of the New South Wales Crown Prosecutors. And I decided that I'd speak about the 4 or 5 most prominent cases that have been prosecuted by our predecessors, and Eugenia was one of them. And to be quite honest, I've never come across a more gripping, a more tragic, a more extraordinary story than the one of Eugenia Falleni.
Sure, I can imagine. What sort of research was involved in it? I mean, was it based off, sort of legal documents and police files, or did you have to do a lot of digging besides that to sort of surface facts that expand on Eugenia's world for the reader?
There was an enormous amount of research. It took me about 2 years to research it fully. In fact, the research took a lot longer than the writing of the story.
Really?
I had access to court transcripts of the trial, of the committal proceedings. I had police statements made by witnesses. I had contemporary newspaper reports. I had a contemporary account that was written by a doctor who visited her in jail. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Yep. I then went to a lot of trouble to get hold of descendants of the people who'd been involved, mainly Eugenia's family members who are still living in New Zealand, and a few of them in Australia, and also descendants of the lawyers who'd been involved in the trial, and various other people who had been involved in it. And putting all of that together, I got an enormous amount of material. I was also assisted by an interview that had been done back in the 1980s by another author who'd done some research into the story, who did an interview with Eugenia's last surviving member of her generation. So it was from a variety of sources.
And so you say the research took longer than the writing. So how long did it take to actually write the manuscript, the book itself, do you reckon?
Look, what I did is I knew that if I was going to write this, I'd have to completely devote myself to doing just that. So I decided to take 10 weeks long service leave from my work as a prosecutor, and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote probably, I don't know, 12, 14 hours a day, and I did most of it during that 10-week period. I had to revise and add bits and pieces here and there, and of course then when my publishers, Simon and Schuster, were given the manuscript, they had 2 editors who looked at it, so there were revisions that had to be done to small sections of it. But by and large, the guts of it I wrote in that 10-week period.
It's only 10 weeks. So in terms of the writing process, so did you you had all the facts, did you sort of draft the timeline of Eugenia's life, of her story that you wanted to tell, and then you sort of filled in the details? Because I guess from my perspective, it must be difficult as a true crime writer, blending facts into a seamless narrative for the reader, because what I found about the novel itself was that it read very much like a story, like a novel, despite the fact that it's so grounded in truth.
Yep. Look, it's almost entirely based upon the documents that I was able to find, and the 2 sections where I've used my intuition to try and work out what must have happened are again based upon known facts, and I've identified in the book where I've actually done that, where I've given my version of what I think must have happened at particularly important sections, 2 important sections of Eugenia's life. But basically it's told in a roughly chronological version. To be quite honest, it's the way I would present an opening address to a jury in a case that I was doing.
Sure. So I guess obviously in telling this story, you sort of lent a lot on your career as well. It's not like someone coming into this without a legal background might not be aware of some of the some of the minutiae of the law. You sort of had all that knowledge to sort of work with as well, so you could sort of present it for the layman as well.
Yes, and it was written by me specifically for the layperson who has no previous knowledge of the law at all. And I also had in mind that I wanted to be available for legal studies students in high school. So it's written in a way that anybody should be able to understand all of it, including the account of the trial.
And we mentioned before we started talking, before we went live, that you were talking to, I believe, some legal studies students today, actually, about the book. Is that correct?
Not today, but I've had a session a bit like this where there were a number of different classes situated in different locations in New South Wales. There were legal studies students, and we had a session like this with, I think it was either 5 or 7 different classes at the same time, and we had a discussion about the story.
Nice, cool. And I'm just talking before I hand it over to our 3 participants today. I'm just wondering about the trial itself, which is sort of infamous as a bit of a travesty of justice, I suppose you might say. Maybe you could explain to us why the trial was so infamous in terms of inadmissible evidence was provided to the court. The jury seemed the testimony of the witnesses seemed slightly prejudiced. Maybe you could tell us why this case is so infamous in terms of Australian criminal law.
Well, look, in its day, it elicited so much interest, mainly because in those days, in 1920, people didn't understand anything about transsexualism, and Eugenia was a classic case of a person born into the body of a woman who firmly believed that she was a male. So she saw herself as being a male trapped in the body of a female. And in those days, people had no conception of that whatsoever. So when she was arrested and charged with the murder of the first wife, Annie Burkett, the media went ballistic, and she was treated abysmally by the press, by the newspapers particularly. And they called her a freak and a pervert and a threat to the moral fabric of society, so that by the time it came to her trial, about 3 months later, there'd been such an enormous amount of adverse publicity that it was very hard for her to get a fair trial. And it was as though the offence that she'd committed in crossing that gender divide was almost more serious than the murder which she was charged with and which she faced trial for.
Yeah, I found that appalling. Yeah.
Yeah, and the trial itself, in its day, it would have been considered as having been a perfectly proper and appropriate trial for somebody charged with murder. But we can look back at some things that happened in the trial today, and we can say, look, there were certain things that happened that really had the great potential to cause a miscarriage of justice. And for reasons that I describe in the book, in my view, Eugenia Falleni was the victim of a miscarriage of justice. There were some extraordinary things that happened in her trial. The main reason why I think there was a miscarriage is that there was a great disparity between the prosecutor who prosecuted her on behalf of the state and the private barrister who represented her as her defence counsel. The prosecutor, William Coyle KC, who was my predecessor, was a very able and experienced advocate and lawyer. The barrister who represented Eugenia, whose name was Archibald MacDonald, was a vastly inferior advocate and lawyer to the prosecutor. And he made some terrible mistakes, some egregious mistakes in representing Eugenia. And he focused on the wrong issues. The main issue that he did focus on was a gross tactical error on his part. He didn't properly prepare Eugenia for the trial. There were a whole lot of things that he didn't do that he should have done, and mistakes that he made, and it all ended up with Eugenia being convicted of the murder of Annie Burkett. And in my view, if the trial were held today, she would almost inevitably have been found not guilty.
When you're reading that trial, I mean, even to the layperson who was sort of going through your explanation of the trial, there were some completely outrageous things that transpired. So I could imagine that as a legal professional, you'd be sitting there just thinking, so is that typical of trials in the day, or was that unusual for her? For that level of the disparity between the counsel was something I wasn't aware of being an issue, which obviously it was. But was that common, or was it really sort of she just really, really unlucky?
Look, those were the very early days of legal aid. I think legal aid had only come in a year or two before her trial, so she was provided with this barrister Archibald MacDonald by the legal aid people in its very early stages. And something like that would never happen today. The legal aid people would ensure that the defendant charged with a serious charge would be represented by somebody whose ability and experience and professionalism matches the seriousness of the charge.
The solicitor was quite able, wasn't he?
Yes.
At the initial charging, and he sat there, but he didn't seem to have much sway with Archibald.
Look, in those days, solicitors were treated very much as the poor second cousin of the barrister, and there was no option as to who was going to represent her at the trial. The solicitor, Maddox Cohen, you're quite right, did a much better job, but he represented her at the committal proceedings, which was in the Magistrates Court, what was then called the Police Court, and he did quite a good job there, but he played very much of a backroom role during the trial. He was there to assist the barrister who was representing Eugenia. But there are other things that happened during the trial that again would never happen today. For example, the police deliberately took Eugenia dressed in his clothes, his male clothes, as Harry Crawford, outside where the press could photograph him on the very first mention of his matter after the day after he was arrested. And the purpose in doing that was so the police could issue a call for anybody who had seen this man in the vicinity of the Lane Cove River Park on a day 3 years earlier.
Yeah.
And of course people came out of the woodwork claiming to have seen this person 3 years earlier. Now today we recognise that that sort of eyewitness testimony is completely unreliable and it wouldn't be allowed to be let in evidence, but in those days that evidence was allowed and people came out of the woodwork and gave evidence. Yes, I saw that person who I thought was a man acting suspiciously in the vicinity of the river. There are other examples like that.
Yeah. I thought one of the most unbelievable things was the skull. I thought, just couldn't believe it. Like, just
Yeah,
like a macabre sort of joke and disrespectful to Annie's family as well as to to everybody else.
Yes, just to explain what happened. One of the Crown witnesses was a fellow called Dr. Audrey Palmer, who had conducted the post-mortem examination on Annie Burkett's body. In fact, he'd conducted it twice. The first time when the body was found in 1917, and the second time after Eugenia was charged in 1920. And Eugenia's barrister cross-examined him, and during the course of this doctor's evidence, he was trying to explain some cracks in the skull that he'd found, and all of a sudden, without any warning, he reached down to his bag and pulled out a skull and asked the judge for permission to point to the cracks in the skull and show the jury, and it turned out that this was the actual skull of Annie Burkett.
It just defies belief.
It does, and that skull was tendered in evidence, which means that it would have gone with the jury into the jury room whilst they were deliberating.
Oh, no. Yeah.
Can you imagine the
terrific.
effect that would have had on the jury? They're deliberating on whether to find Eugenia guilty or not guilty, and the victim's skull is sitting there in the jury room with them.
Looking at them, yeah.
The effect would have been horrendous.
Yeah, yes. Oh. Yeah, that really, there was a lot of things that were explained that went wrong there, but that one I just thought, you can't just be whipping that out of your back.
Yes.
But, different times, but I think you just say in the book that that's the only time you've come across that happening.
It's the only time that I know of something like that happening, but the judge allowed it to happen, so I can only assume that sort of thing was permitted in those days.
Yeah.
Do you think the courts are seen as a form of entertainment?
Sorry,
Simon. Do you think the courts are seen as a form of entertainment?
Look, in 1920, I think there were a lot of women who went to the trial of Eugenia Falleni because they were fascinated by the idea of somebody who had derived the benefits in their society of living life as a male. And I think they thought this was so intriguing, and it was mainly women who were sitting in the public gallery. And they were very hostile towards Eugenia. Today, I think that, people still come to listen to criminal trials because it's fascinating. It's an insight into the lives of other people, often lives that have gone tragically wrong. So there's an enormous degree of personal interest in these cases, and I must admit that I get people who come and sit in the back of the courtroom during my trials, and they'll sometimes come up to me and say, "Oh, look, this is much more interesting than going down to George Street and going to the movies because this is for real."
I don't know whether it's something that I'm tempted to do, but I think I'd rather read it.
Yeah.
Particularly as it's real.
Yes. People ask me, how do I cope with all of the tragedy that unfolds during the trials that I do. In a sense, I think because the courtroom is very clinical and very, it's removed from everyday life, I think that it takes away some of that emotional aspect. And on occasions, I've done a case at trial, and then some years later there's been some reenactments in a television program of that same case, and I haven't been able to watch the reenactments because it's just been too violent to watch, and it's affected me too much. So it's an artistic reenactment is sometimes more shocking, I think, than to hear the evidence in the cool, cold, professional atmosphere of a courtroom where everybody's doing their best to try and remain unemotional and professional.
Do you think, having covered Eugenia's story, that is that it for you now? Do you think you'll go back and do a similar book, or this was the one sort of main interest because I mean only get so much long service leave?
Look, I enjoyed writing Eugenia so much that I decided I'm definitely going to keep writing, and I have already written another manuscript, but it's a fairly short one, so I've still got to find out whether my publishers are going to be willing to publish something that's shorter than Eugenia, or whether I'm going to have to go and find another case to write about. But what I find I really enjoy is writing about historical true crime cases that are bizarre and that enable us to look back not just on the legal system in those days, but on what life was like and on the values that were held in the community. And I found that aspect of Eugenia's story quite fascinating.
And as readers, that's what we found fascinating as well. It was more than a true crime story. It was a picture of what was happening on the day, about people's lives, their work habits, what they were dressing, what they were doing on their days off. It was really, for me, I found that really, really interesting.
Yes, yeah. Look, it was really interesting for me, and perhaps the most interesting part was to do research on people's views about sexuality in those days. And for instance, people in those days conflated, that is, they combined the two concepts of homosexuality and transsexualism. They didn't appreciate that sexual preference and sexual identity are completely different. In those days, they had this idea that if you were attracted to somebody of the same gender as yourself, it's because inside your body there must be some parts that are of the opposite gender, so that you were kind of like half male, half female, and it was your female part that was going for another male, or your male part that was going for another female. They just had no idea about gender identity disorders, and no sympathy or understanding, and of course there were no services for people like that. So you have to look at somebody like Harry Crawford, Eugenia's male identity, and you have to really marvel at the incredible risks that he took to live what he saw as being a life of integrity, because he was constantly faced with the threat of being outed, and he must have
been living in constant fear.
Yeah, constant fear, constant tension, but yet it was still worth his while, because he saw that as being, for him, a life where he was able to express the way that he really felt, a life of integrity. So it really exemplifies to what extent people will go to try and express their true inner selves.
She must have been so lonely at the beginning.
Sorry?
No.
Oops. She must have been so lonely. Such a lonely place to be other in a community that was so rigid and that had so little understanding. It must have been a really hard life.
There were sections of her life where she was very lonely. when she was a teenager, she clashed dreadfully with her family. Her family had no understanding for this firstborn female child, firstborn daughter, who wanted to live the life of a tomboy. So she must have been very lonely when she was doing battle with her family, and that's what caused her to enrol as a male seaman on a ship to try and escape that oppressive environment in New Zealand. Then when she came to Sydney and was pregnant and gave birth, she had this Italian couple who were childless who took her in and eventually took over her daughter. Now after that, the next 22 years, Harry lived life as a male so successfully that he was actually very popular. He was popular with his workmates. He was popular with women. He was viewed as being a good conversationalist. He was funny. He would drink with his mates. He'd swear with his mates. At his workplace, he was strong. He was wiry. He was hardworking. So he was quite popular. But after his arrest in 1920, when his true identity as Eugenia became known, he was totally and utterly without any support or friendship, and was totally alone. His second wife, Lizzie, just completely disappeared from the scene. The first wife, of course, had died. His family, her family in New Zealand, had nothing to do with her. The only people who would have anything to do with her were her two lawyers, Maddox Cohen and Archibald MacDonald. And by the time it came to her trial, she was just a shell of a woman. You
can really see that in the photographs, can't you? Just
yes,
deterioration. It's harrowing. She looks half the woman.
Yeah.
And so aged, and so defeated.
Yes, yes.
I think the trial by media was really, for her, being given that attention, being paraded.
Yeah.
She just had no hope.
Yep.
She was defeated before she even stood in the stand.
And then, of course, after she was convicted of murder, she was initially sentenced to death, but the death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. And ironically, the reason for that was that she was a woman, and there hadn't been a woman hung in New South Wales, had been hanged in New South Wales for over 20 years. Had she been a biological male, she probably would have been hanged.
I'm really disappointed that she didn't take up some of the advantages that the prison offered her and learn to read or write. Her life could have changed.
Yeah.
Not having that literacy, I think, again, was another handicap.
It was, indeed. And being of Italian background, from an Italian family, was also a severe handicap in those days. There was a lot of prejudice in Australia and in New Zealand, where her parents emigrated, against Italians. So, I mean, she was an outsider on almost every count. But ironically, when she was in jail serving a life sentence because the death sentence was commuted by the government, she was able to have a very close friendship with another woman who was a member of Sydney's high society, of a kind that would not have been tolerated if she was outside. So, I mean, jail has its own rules, its own standards, its own morals, and the great irony was that she had this very close, warm relationship in jail that she probably would never have had if she'd been outside.
And life after jail is something different again, isn't it?
Yes.
Those same rules don't apply. Those conditions aren't there, and things fall down again.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Well, she did make a reasonable fist of it, with the houses and the building it up.
Yes.
And then the whole thing just fell to bits at the end again. I mean, poor woman.
Yes, she had a very tragic life, and there were so many twists and turns that if I had written this and called it a novel, people would come at me and say, oh, come on, Mark, you couldn't get all of those things happening in one lifetime, and there are parts of it that just don't hang together. So it is very much a case of truth being stranger than fiction.
Yes, absolutely. At the end of the story, I'm sorry, Carol, I jumped on you again.
No, that's fine. Go.
At the end of the story, there's a bit of a catch-up on where people ended up. But there's no mention of Lizzie. Was she ever seen again? Like, did anyone ever track her down, or did she just go and start a new life with a new name? And
she totally disappeared, to the extent that the prosecutor was not able to find her at the time of the trial, and everybody lost trace of her. I must admit I didn't try and contact any descendants, but she had completely disappeared without trace and was never heard of again, so far as I'm aware.
Oh, okay. That's good for her too.
She was initially hounded by the media as well, they questioned her in a very cruel manner. You know, how could you possibly not have known that your husband was a woman? And initially, she thought that when the police told her that her husband was a woman, she laughed at them and said, "Look, I know that you're wrong because I'm pregnant to my husband."
Oh,
but it turned out that she was of a mature age when she married Harry. He was 46, she was 50. And by the time it came to Harry being arrested, she was in effect going through the early stages of menopause. And she thought she was pregnant, and it took some weeks after his arrest before she found out that she wasn't pregnant at all. And then, of course, she realised that what the police had told her was the truth.
Yeah.
So sad for everybody, really, wasn't it? So sad for everybody.
Yes, and Josephine, that was her daughter. It was very hard for her. She had a very tough life. I mean, she knew from the age of 7 that this strange man who would come occasionally to visit at the home of this Italian couple where she was living, she was told that it was her mother. So you can imagine what effect that would have on a 7-year-old.
It's interesting that the Italian community didn't tell anybody, and I guess you've sort of explained that a bit in that they were very much treated as the other at that time in society, but I feel like they all knew. But, I mean, no one even told, didn't tell, must have been, was it Josephine's daughter or something, and it was like such a long time afterwards when, oh, it's just not right, you really need to know that, you know, that's actually it.
Yeah, what happened is that Annie Burkett's son was 13 when she disappeared, and it was only when he was 17 that another Italian woman told him that the person he thought was his stepfather, Harry Crawford, was actually a woman. And they'd kept it secret from him for a number of reasons. I think firstly, I think they were sensitive to Harry's privacy, but also I think they thought that a 13-year-old boy, or even a 14 or 15 or 16-year-old boy, particularly in those days, was just too young to be told such a scandalous piece of information. And of course he was deeply, deeply shocked at the thought that his mother had been married to a man who was really a woman.
So what happens to Eugenia now? As you've said in the book and said here, you see it as a misjustice. Is there any opportunity to go back and somehow clear her name?
Look, there could be, I suppose. It's been done in another case quite recently, another case in which there was a clear miscarriage of justice. So it's something that could be done, but it would take a lot of effort, and to what avail? So
you've already done the work.
Indeed. What I have done though is Eugenia was buried in an unmarked grave at Rookwood Cemetery in Sydney, and I've conducted a Eugenia tour to take people to the various locations of her life in Sydney to help raise money for a committee that's set up to raise money to put a gravestone on her gravesite. So I think that's a more fitting tribute to Eugenia than an acquittal by a court.
We're just about out of time, I'm afraid, but before we go, we have a lot of aspiring writers who watch these hangouts. I'm just wondering if maybe you have any advice.
If you're really lucky, like I was, you find something that you're really passionate about. I think that's a prerequisite if you're going to write something that people are going to really enjoy reading. You've got to be really passionate about your subject, and I was, and I still am. I mean, Eugenia was published in about 15, 18 months ago, and I still get lots of invitations to speak about her story to libraries, to book clubs, to people all over the place. So the story still motivates me. But I think the other thing is you've got to be very determined to do the writing. So you've got to be prepared to sit down and write and write and write and write and write and revise and revise and revise and revise. So it's a lot of work, but if you're passionate about it, it's not work. It's actually fun. It's something that you enjoy doing. I think that you've also got to have perseverance. I was particularly lucky in that my first approach to a publisher, Simon & Schuster, was they accepted the book with glee, but I think that if you don't have that sort of fortunate occurrence happening to you, you've just got to be persistent, and there are lots of stories of very successful writers who send their manuscripts to publisher after publisher after publisher before they find somebody who's willing to publish it. So you've got to have faith in yourself. You've got to have confidence in yourself. And I think at a certain stage, after you've done all the research, you've just got to say, okay, stop. I've done as much research as I can do. Now I'm just going to sit down and I'm going to write. And you write from here and from here, from your heart, from your head and from your heart. And in a way, you can put aside the research and just write, and then you can fill in the details from your notes and from your records afterwards. So those are the lessons that I've learnt from my limited experience of writing one true crime story. My other publications have all been very technical, legal works, which of course are very different and don't appeal to the general community. But yeah, as I said, I found it a wonderful experience, very satisfying experience, and I've done it again, and I'm going to continue doing it.
Well, Mark, thank you very much for joining us today at the Reading Room, and we wish you all the best in the future, and we look forward to reading your next book too. So thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.